Hello trumpet players, and this also applies to musicians in general. This is the first video in our music listening series. In this video we're going to talk about when should you spend your time listening. These first three videos are about what I call passive listening. What is passive listening? Passive listening is when you put the music on and you do not pay attention. You go about your day. Maybe you have homework to do, maybe you have chores to do, maybe you're driving, maybe you're at work and you have the music in your earbuds. Passive listening is, in my opinion, just as important as the other type. What is that? The other type of listening is active listening. Passive listening is when you're not paying attention. Active listening is when you are paying attention. I have always felt that the passive listening, it has a direct connection to your subconscious. I might be wrong about this. I'm not saying it scientifically. I'm saying it anecdotally. Maybe someday people will decide to do research on it. But for now, it doesn't matter to me whether it's right or not. That's been my experience. When you do your listening without paying attention and you go about your day, it's sort of like opening a little thumb drive port and putting that music right in your head. Now, it's not there for you to use necessarily. Like you won't be able to play necessarily the licks that you've been listening to or anything direct like that. But the general stuff like swing and expression and tone quality and stuff like that, those things seep into your mind. And it's really there's no better way to learn how to play your instrument, because it's the easiest thing you can do. Put the music on, right? So this specific video, now this is the first in an 8-video series. And this specific video, we're not having a introduction because I'm talking about listening all the time. I joke around whenever I talk about listening because I talk about it so often that I say people roll their eyes. It's not 100% true. People don't really roll their eyes. I have had students that every time I mention listening, they're like, right? But I have always said listening is more important than practicing. And that includes the passive listening. Passive listening is part of your listening package, and the whole listening package is more important than practicing. I have always clarified after I say that it does not replace practice. We're just talking about importance here. Passive listening and the whole listening package is more important than practicing. It doesn't mean you don't have to practice. It means that your practice is going to be better now because you did the listening. All right? So, when should you do the listening? First of all, the subject of when deals with time. Let's say that you should be doing about 10 hours per week of listening. 10 hours per week. If you want to make real progress on your instrument, you should be doing 10 hours a week. That's roughly 2 hours a day for 4 or 5 days. And the time when you should do this is those times when you don't have to be thinking, for example, if you're doing chores around the house, how much do you have to really think about that? Now, I did say homework, but there's some kinds of homework that you shouldn't be doing your listening during that time. There's some kinds, if you're doing, I guess, it's been a long time. I have not had to do homework in a long time, right? I'm one of those old folk. But like advanced maths, anything that requires very serious reading, there are some kinds of homework where you can listen. How about walking between classes? Did you know you could do that, right? Maybe your school doesn't allow that. Let me tell you, I taught for, I want to say 7 years. I taught in the 90s at the high school for performing and visual arts here in Houston. We call it HSPVA. I taught a class there in jazz improvisation, like I said, throughout the 90s. And the top students there, so I don't normally brag, because first of all, it's not for me to brag. If you take it this way, you took it the wrong way. Most people would think I'm bragging. The students that were in my class have gone on, some of them, have gone on to become the best jazz musicians in the world for their age group. And it's not a coincidence that those students were the ones that had, it wasn't earbuds back then, it was, Walkman headphones, right? But they had the headphones on between class, at lunch. Anytime they could get some listening in, they did listening. All the time. Anytime there was a moment for them to listen to music, they listened to it. And we're going to get to this later, but they weren't listening to the music of the day. They were listening to the music they were trying to be able to play. They were listening to bands like Kenny Garrett and stuff like that. I say Kenny Garrett, I happen to know some of them were listening to Kenny Garrett for sure. So there's opportunities like that when you can put the music on and just go about your day. You just put it on. There's also times doing yard work outside and stuff like that. If you have to, let's just say any kind of yard work, you put the earbuds in. I think I covered all that. So yes, if we're talking about when you should do this, I guess the answer is all the time, except for when you can't. It should be almost constant. If you really want to do this, you should be listening all the time. You can have listening get-togethers. Let's say you and your friend are both trying to become great trumpet players. Then you get together, you listen to great trumpet music together. There's so many stories that I can tell about people who did listening. I think it was my last trumpet teacher, Dick Schaefer. The way I remember him telling this story, he said one of the kids, I say kids, these are college students, one of the students at his university in the dorm that he was staying in had the door open, had the record player on, and was listening to Mahler 5. He walked by the room when the door was open, heard Mahler 5, and he said that was it. That was it for him. From that point forward, he decided he was going to be a orchestral trumpet player. And he did. He was the second trumpet of the Houston Symphony for many, many years. In fact, if I remember right, when he retired, they said that he had the longest tenure of any previous brass player in that orchestra. And it all started with that one chance happening, that chance occurrence of him hearing Mahler 5, Chicago Symphony Mahler 5, while he was walking down the hall at the dorms. And yes, and same thing, Dennis Thotson. Dennis Thotson used to be in the Woody Herman band, and he tells stories about how they used to listen to music together on the bus. So you can get together and have, maybe you can't call them parties, but get together and listen to this music with someone that likes that kind of music. You can listen to it with them. Do your homework together or something. I remember reading the old Downbeat magazines. I don't read Downbeat or anything. I don't even know if Downbeat is still going. I don't read that stuff now because I don't like hero worship. Really, I don't like hero worship. And I don't know if it was always like that, but I started noticing more and more of that kind of article. I'm more interested in the details, right? I want to know about the guy's life. How did he practice? Stuff like that. And they're more interested in who did he play with and how many, that more on the fame side. And that just doesn't interest me. So, but back when I was reading Downbeat, they used to have at the end of the magazine these famous musicians, and they would ask them to listen to music without telling them what it was. And sometimes it was some really off-the-wall stuff. And most of the time, these famous musicians knew those recordings. And what I find so remarkable about that, these guys are already there. These guys are already, the people they used to interview like that at the end of the magazine are already the top of the top of the top. They don't have to do that for them to be good enough. They don't have to listen to someone's album that's actually in the hierarchy would be considered a lesser musician. But they did. They listened to all of it. They were so intimately familiar with all those recordings. Why is that? Because when you're a great musician, that's what you do. It reminds me, I was a student at the University of Houston when Terrence Blanchard was the guest soloist, and I played in the jazz band when he was the guest soloist. And he said some very interesting things on the break, right? One of my favorites was, he says you can tell, because at the time he was playing with a lot of orchestras, and he says you can tell by looking at the musicians whether they're jazz guys or not. He says that the jazz guys, when they get into it, they rock back and forth like this, oh man, and when the classical guys are getting into the swing stuff, they rock side to side like this. I'll never forget that story. But he also said, on the same break, he said, when you're hanging out with the serious cats, when you're hanging out, in other words, when you're hanging out with the greats, they're not talking about chicks. They're not talking about food. They're not talking about clothes styles and stuff like that. What do you think they're talking about? Not difficult to guess, is it? They're talking about music. The greats, they're not thinking, oh, this is my break, don't bother me with my work, right? They're not thinking like that. These guys are absorbed in the music. That's what made them great, for a part of it. I don't think it's a coincidence that all of the greats of the greats of the greats have been that deeply absorbed into listening. That's not a coincidence. And you know, so the topic of this video is when, and basically it's turning out to be more of an introduction anyway. When should you do your listening? All the time, except for whenever you can't. If there are times where the listening will cause a distraction that would either cost you money or make it unsafe or hurt your grades, then don't do any listening. Otherwise, you should have the music going on constantly. That's passive listening. We'll talk more about other kinds of listening later, but that's passive listening. And the great players always did a whole bunch of that. Always. You cannot be, and you know what? You cannot be a great player without it. I'm convinced of this. I was saying, you know what? Over the years, I have discovered that this is not just because you're right, you know, a lot of people will, now that they've heard this, say, oh, I'm going to do all that listening because I want to be a great player. And that's almost offensive, right? The real reason why we listen is because it's cultural. It connects us to that culture. And I'm going to talk more about that in the other videos. You can't excel at an art as a genuine outsider. You can't do that. You know, when it comes to that, I always tell people this, and it's, you know, when I tell these kind of stories, I'm not talking about a single person. I'm taking all of my past experiences and combining them into this one story. So there have been many times where people have come up to me and they want me to help them get gigs as jazz, you know, get some jazz gigs. And I asked them, do you listen to jazz? And the answer is no, they don't listen to jazz, not at all. But they want the gig. And that's offensive. They want to take the money, but they don't want to be part of the culture. And to a lesser extent, it's the same way with people who just want to be good at jazz. If the only reason you're listening is so that you can get better, you missed the point. Jazz is a living art form. It's living and breathing, and it's comprised of individuals that work together and are inspired by each other. If you say, oh, I don't want to be part of that, but I want to be a great jazz player, well, that's not going to work. And the same thing is true for the classical stuff. It's just as true, it's just a little bit different with the classical stuff. You know, I only use the jazz as an example because that's what people ask me, how can you help me get gigs? They're not saying, can you help me get classical gigs, right? I'm known as a jazz player. So they want me to help them get, even though I played classical, right? They want me to help them get jazz gigs. But they don't want to be jazz players. So yes, the answer is you should listen as often as you can. Shoot for at least 10 hours per week. And I'll tell you what, you'll see a huge change in your playing. Alright? Okay, so that's what I have in this video. We have 2 more passive gigs. Passive listening gigs, I'm calling it a gig. 2 more passive listening videos. And this one was about when you should do passive listening. The next is where? Is it where? Anyway, I don't remember. The last one is how. Okay? Alright. So, God bless you guys. We'll see you on the next video. Thank you.